Do your foundational memories about crime revolve around the war on drugs?
Were you scared to go to New York City, specifically Times Square, as a young person because of its crime-ridden streets?
If you avoided taking candy from strangers, unusual white vans, and getting in vehicles with anyone who didn't know your family's secret code word, you might be an 80s baby and a Xennial, and we are too. Hi, I'm Katie.
And I'm Dani, and welcome everyone to Generation In Between, a Xennial podcast, where we remember, we revisit, and we sometimes relearn all kinds of things from our 80s childhoods and 90s teen and young adulthoods.
Yes, and today we've got part one of a two-parter for you on true crime of the 80s and 90s, starting, of course, with the 1980s. Dani, how excited are you for this two-part series?
Well, what's the scale? Are we doing
0 to 10?
I'm at a 5, guys, because I am not a true crime junkie like Katie. We know Katie loves some true crime. I don't like it. As y'all know, I've mentioned that before in past episodes because it's real life. And now I'm saying all this as I just spent part of today watching Pet Sematary. And then I also last night when I couldn't sleep, which we'll get into that in a minute, I was watching on YouTube old episodes of Tales from the Crypt. We also watched The Shining a few nights ago. So I like scary stuff. I just don't want it to be real. Okay. I don't want it to be real. So I'm a little nervous. Actually, we'll tell you what we're doing, how we're recording in just a moment, but I actually have a glass of wine while we're recording. Do not worry. It is 7:24 at night. Like
she's home.
I am at home.
Not in my studio because we had a little thing this week called Hurricane Milton.
Oh man.
And it just it was one of those unpredictable things. Obviously a lot of devastation in the past. Where Dani and I are located on Florida's East Coast, we didn't see a ton of destruction. Of course, some people still did, but it threw off the schedule of everyone all week, as natural disasters do.
Yeah, facts. And so our schedule's all wonky. Plus, Katie's studio doesn't have power currently. We don't know. It should come back on soon? Question mark.
Yeah, I'm told any moment now. I've been checking the Florida Power and Light site because it'll tell you like if your power has been restored and not yet. And that's normally where we record. And recording at either of our homes was not really an option because our kids have like a 6-day weekend at this point because of the hurricane and Indigenous Peoples Day on Monday. Yeah. So they've got, so there's many of them and friends and
especially at Katie's house.
Pets and mostly at my house. So hopefully, even if you're listening where you normally listen, you should go check out our YouTube because we said we're going to post this on our YouTube no matter what. So that's just Generation In Between podcast. If you just look us up on YouTube, I'm going to put it in the show notes too. This will be on there, and hopefully we'll have at least the audio from other episodes going up soon, and maybe more video coming.
Oh God.
But I am in my bathroom, and you can only see from my rib cage up. And so Dani was like, "Are you sitting on your toilet?"
It totally looks like you're in a toilet.
I laughed and it's so hard. I am not, but I could see why she would think that.
It's also like super white behind you. So she looks like she's on a toilet in heaven. Plus she's wearing like a headset. Like I was like, oh, you look like a nice gamer.
Yeah, we're a mess right now.
I know.
But I have my hoops behind the gamer headset.
You do. I am not prepared. I have a hair appointment tomorrow. Priorities after and my hair looks bad. I'm sitting in my little chair I have in my bedroom. That is a reader's corner. If you're on YouTube, you can see, I'll give you a little peek at my little books right there. That's just some of them.
Aww.
So I'm in my nice little grandma chair, but the lighting is terrible. So
if we end up doing anything like this in the future, we have an idea of how to record simultaneously on our phones for video, maybe in the studio with some ring lights. So that may be coming. But if we end up doing any more like this, we'll have to figure out mics and lights and all of that. But this is just our like, hey, we're just gonna go for it. And
Yeah.
here we are. We're
We don't
on
want to mess up and not have an episode. So here it is.
exactly, exactly.
Right.
So whether you are looking at this on YouTube or you are listening normally, we're glad you're here. If you were in Hurricane Milton's path or Hurricane Helene,
Yeah.
I hope you're well. Hopefully you have power and a home. And if you are dealing with anything like flooding, I know our listener Candy uh, had some flooding before the hurricanes, like
In her
unrelated.
house? In her
Uh-huh.
house? Oh
Uh-huh. So she's
no.
been like, you know how it is to like
Yes.
gut and renovate. So she's been dealing with all of that. And then we've had like back-to-back hurricanes. But I just talked to her earlier. She seems to be doing okay. They were out of
Oh,
power for
good.
a little, but it's back. So we're thinking of you guys, and hopefully you are in a good place. And if not, we're sending our good vibes. You get back to that good place soon.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So back to the topic at hand, which is true crime of the 80s.
I'm
So
so
we are 80s.
nervous.
I know, I know. It's okay.
I'm like
Look, I
so
had to
nervous.
boil it down. I had to
I
boil it down.
know.
And I think you're really going to like the discussion component. I think you're going to have a
Okay.
lot to say. It's not
Okay.
all here's what happened to people and here's the crimes. There, I do have some, but it's kind of more of like a cultural look. 80s, which then will feed into the 90s, but kind of
Okay.
where it's all coming from. So we're 80s babies. I was born in 82. Danny was born in 80. So, like a lot of the crime that was happening in the 80s, I wasn't necessarily noticing in real time.
Yeah.
Like, there are things I remember hearing about as I got older, or of course, now there's like true crime podcasts, of which I am a listener, and documentaries and all of that. But as a kid, I don't really remember like thinking about a lot of these things. Um, so I've heard some of these cases I'm going to talk about today, but I don't remember hearing about them as a kid. But Danny, what about you?
Well, as I've talked about before, I was a scaredy cat child. Um, my sister was so funny. I was talking to her on the phone before the storm hit. She was calling because she lives in Oregon now. She used to live in Louisiana. She made it through Katrina. So, like, anyway, she also gets storm anxiety, but now she's away from them. So she called me and we were chatting. She was like, um, she's like, I was talking about you at work today because I was telling them how nervous, like how anxious you are. And they were like, oh, well, that's probably because of Katrina. And my sister said, no, Danny just came out of the womb with anxieties. So like,
Oh,
she's right. They just change sometimes. But
hmm
as a kid, I feel like I was aware of crime stuff because my grandma was around a lot and my dad also watched the news. They were big news watchers. And so I did know because my ears would perk up because I was scared, right? So like, of course you're scared, you're like extra aware of things that are going on. Of course I can think of some in my head, but I'm not going to say them until I'm sure you'll probably talk about them. So
hmm
mostly though, what I remember true crime stuff was 90s
Yes.
because that's when we were a little older, right?
Yes. Same,
Mm-hmm.
same. In fact, I had to look a few up because I was like, I think that was 90s. And most of the ones that came to my mind immediately remembering as I was growing up are in the 90s. So
Yeah,
those are coming. And just like a note about true crime, I totally understand what you're saying, Danny. And I think there is, and this is not you, by the way, but I know there's a school of thought that like true crime can be kind of like ex kind of exploiting victims and that sort of thing. And there is some of
yeah,
that certainly goes on, like people talking about these terrible stories for their own like sake.
sure.
I try really hard to cultivate content that kind of goes beyond that. Crime Junkie is a huge one. That's arguably the biggest true crime podcast out there. And it started because its host was a member of Crime Stoppers and was trying to like help solve cold cases and things like that. And all the money they make goes back into these
Mhm.
organizations that actually fight for victims' rights and to change laws and they fund organizations that do open cold cases and try to get answers for people. So I really try to think of it like, what can we learn from these
Yeah.
things for our own safety? But also, there might be families out there that are still looking for answers that they
Mhm.
couldn't get in the 80s or the 90s or the 70s or whenever, but now the technology exists, but nobody's got the money to do it. And so some of these advocates for that, are who I try to follow. There's an organization called Season of Justice, which is just that like we're in a season of justice now where we have the tools to solve a lot of these. And it's a nonprofit that funds those types of things. So I just
Hmm.
wanted to say that like there
Yeah.
is a whole like, oh my God, like, oh, you just listened to that because of whatever. Like I don't know. It's salacious and it is, which unfortunately makes it kind of interesting. But there's also a side that like these are real people. And some of their families are still looking for answers.
Yeah, I think that's part of it too for me is that, you know, I you can't separate, like I always tell my kids, like you can't ever separate somebody's humanity. So like even though you're hearing a story, it's very easy for us to trick ourselves to think like to separate. Do you know what I mean?
Hmm.
Like when
Yeah.
you're hearing a story, you want to separate, but I just cannot do that. Like I can't, like I always will think of like the victim and their family and like what was going on. And you know, with serial killers and all of that, I have like some friends who are like obsessed with like serial killer stuff, which I don't know why they are, but I just think so many times when they make movies, I
Hmm.
just think about all these victims that are just thrown into a movie for 2 seconds and then, that's it for entertainment purposes. I think that's why I have a hard time too. I can't separate. Like
Hmm.
I just think of the loss, especially when it's children or like violence against women. I just have a real aversion. But I'm
Yeah.
a big girl and I'm gonna make it through today.
Yeah, I mean, every point you're making is totally valid. I know when the most recent Dahmer documentary came
Oh,
out, or it wasn't even, I don't
yeah.
even think it was a documentary. It was more of like a
No,
mini
it was the
series.
movie they did with
Yeah.
the guy who was in American Horror Story the first season, that
Hmm.
guy. Great actor. Um, yeah, there was
And
some
like
stuff.
there was some stuff with that where the victims' families weren't notified. They weren't
Mhm.
compensated. Imagine that was your family back in the 70s and now it's 2024 if you're still living and like fighting for
Yeah.
this person. So, there's definitely some things around that are problematic 100%.
Mm.
So I would like to acknowledge that because that does exist. And I think in general we can do better. And here we are doing one. But don't worry, I'm going to try to actually drop some knowledge on you today and not just talk about crime.
Okay.
So
I'm here for the knowledge. I'm here for the
let's
knowledge.
let's start there, all right? So um, I think we need to look at an overview of what crime in America really looked like. In the 1980s, of course, there was crime everywhere. But I'm just mainly going to talk about America here. Um, the 80s actually saw a very significant rise in crime rates, particularly violent crime in the US. So FBI data found that violent crime increased through the 1970s, through the early 1980s, peaking in 1980, right? So it kind of went as high as it could go in 1980, tapered off a little, and then once 1990 hit, it actually really dropped and has not gotten back to those levels. So I think that's just like important to note that we're actually statistically safer today than we were in 1980 as far as being average citizens. So the we have to mention I mentioned the war on drugs in the
Yeah.
intro, but there really was a crack cocaine epidemic. Now, how we attacked that as a nation
Right.
is questionable. But there was a lot of that happening, and because of the sale of it, and just, how people's brain states are altered when drugs are
Hmm.
involved, homicides did double between 1985 and 1990. And in 1990, that year, murders peaked in New York City with 2,245 people murdered in New York
And
City alone.
do you think that's because the population was rising as well there in New York at that time?
Could be. Yeah. I mean, those things could definitely be related.
Um, I wanted to ask when you mentioned a few minutes ago, you said that there was an increase in violent crime.
Mhm.
Is that the definition of a violent crime, like when it involves like a weapon?
So, violent crime includes murder, rape, or sexual assault, robbery, and aggravated assault.
Okay.
Most of the time, that will include a weapon, but it doesn't have to.
Okay. Okay.
Um, Generally, aggravated assault does mean there's a weapon. Otherwise, it's just assault, like different degrees of assault. So, in general, it would include a weapon, something like a knife or a gun, but not always,
Okay. Just
because you
curious.
can commit violence without a weapon, with
True
just your two
facts.
bare hands, if you really
Or if
wanted to.
you're a cat. So,
What
yeah.
do you mean?
Because I just watched Pet Cemetery. Sorry.
Oh, oh, okay,
Like
okay.
what?
It's like, oh my
What?
gosh, a cat.
Yeah.
Um,
No,
that's
sorry.
really
I because
funny.
we just you've never seen it, right? Sorry. I shouldn't have said that
That
because you've
is
never
the
seen it.
one I have
Oh,
seen.
you have seen Pet
That one I
Cemetery.
had, but then I got the ending completely wrong when we were talking about it with Hunt. But I have seen that one. I thought the
Okay.
cat came back, so I mean, I don't
He
know.
does. He
Oh,
does, but he's the first one thing to come back. Anyway, sorry.
that's what
We're
it
not going
was.
backwards. Sorry.
Okay, yeah. Listen to our Stephen King episode. All
Yeah.
right, so we kind of already touched on homicide rates were going up.
Okay.
Violent crime, which we just talked about, did peak in 1981. It the statistic is 596 incidents per 100,000 people. I did not do the percentages on that, but apparently that's pretty high.
I'm interested to know when it's documented crime, right? Because obviously
Hmm.
it has to be documented crime, correct?
To have
Um,
these statistics, yeah.
yeah, right. I'm curious to know. I'm always like, whenever we have numbers for crime rates in metropolitan areas where there are people of various income levels, et cetera, I'm always like, how accurate are they and how many people were wrongly
Hmm.
arrested or whatever. Not that there wasn't stuff going on because I don't know, I wasn't there. But
Hmm.
I always, and I'm not questioning your research. I That's just something that always pops into my brain. When it's like, I wonder. I always
Yeah.
wonder that with any number related to our criminal justice system and our police
Yeah.
force.
I mean, it's a great point. It's got to be more nuanced than just like the number of arrests for
Oh
certain
yeah.
things.
Oh yeah.
And to your point, there's so many unreported, right?
Right.
So we're saying we're safer now because in 1980, like all these things were reported, but for one, sex trafficking is a way bigger problem now than in
Mhm.
1980. And a lot of that, we don't even know the extent of it because they're not
Mhm.
finding these people and arresting these people and breaking up these rings. So that's like one example where it's like, oh, we're safer, but is there just all this crime sort of happening? And then were there just arrests? There is some of that in the 80s for sure, quotas, things like that, trying to clean up the war on drugs that kind of padded some arrests, right?
Mhm.
Um, so you're right. It's more nuanced than just than the numbers on the page for sure. Um, Property crime also was pretty high in the 80s. So that's, burglary, motor vehicle theft. There were over 5,300 property crimes per 100,000 people. So that's about 8 times as many violent crimes were
Jeez, that's a
property.
lot.
Yeah, that's a lot.
That's a lot.
Um, so anyway, it's kind of just giving you a picture,
Okay.
at least based on like the public records available to us then and now. It was much higher in the 80s than it had been in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and then it actually tapered off some in the 90s. So there's lots of different things we'll get into as to why that might be. Some we already touched on.
Yeah.
Potentially,
Yeah.
potentially it wasn't any higher. It was just being reported at a
Right.
higher rate. So, in my notes here, I have serial killer part because I'm not going to talk about any particular serial killer, but I think we can't talk about 1980s true crime without mentioning serial killers. Okay. Um, the idea of a serial killer or, a person who thrives on murdering people and like more than one person, that idea wasn't born in the 1980s, right? So serial killers have been around for all time, of course, but in American culture, they really became a conversation piece beginning in the 1970s-ish, due in part a lot to the Ted Bundys of the world. He wasn't the only one. But as I mentioned earlier, his crimes took place he only over the course of 4 years, which is
Mm.
wild to me. 1974 to 78. I mean, then he was arrested and tried and all the things, died in 1990 in prison. So the term serial killer is generally attributed to a former FBI special agent named Robert Ressler, who he popularized the phrase serial homicide in the 1970s to describe a pattern of multiple murders committed over a period of time with a cooling off period between killings. And this basically kind of took off from there. So serial homicides turned into like the crimes of serial killers, and that's the concept we understand today. So I think a lot of people think like you go on a killing spree, but it's actually for true serial killers, it's more calculated than that, and this cooling off period is a part of it, which is kind of scary because
Terrified. Like
it's terrifying.
I don't know what my face looks like because it's in a tiny box at the top of my screen that I can't
Yeah.
see. But if y'all are watching YouTube, I don't know. Like Katie's like giving this definition in my face. I feel it go like
Like, oh no, let's go. We don't need to. I'm like,
it's
we
like,
can't
oh
talk
my
about this
God.
then without talking about serial
I
killers. And Danny's like,
mean,
yes, we can actually.
actually, we could.
We
I mean,
can
I
keep
brought it up though,
going.
to be fair. I did bring it
Yeah,
up.
see,
I
see,
did.
there you go.
I know.
So there were definitely more serial killers coming to light in the 80s for sure. I think I read quite a few articles and commentary on this particular thing. And like the Ted Bundy situation was in most American people's minds an anomaly, like a freak thing. Kind of like, and I mean it was, but it was kind of in the 1980s that as more of these types of criminals came to light, that it became less of like a wow, that's a wild thing that's never happened in the history of time to oh no, like these people live among us and it happens more than we know, right? Like more than we realize. And certainly we have a concept of that today for sure, but in the 80s is where that was really coming about. Um, so I found one stat that said in the 80s there were at least 200 active serial killers in the United States alone. 200 that they were like trying to find, had
What?
similar patterns, caught some of them, didn't catch other ones. However, there's some good news.
That's
There
not good
was a
news
downward trend over the next 2 decades in that.
because they got better at it. See?
Maybe
See, that's
there's
where
an
my brain
argument
goes.
for that.
If you have an anxious brain, that's where your brain goes, is because they learn from people's errors and they're like,
Hmm.
also, Hollywood also does that when you watch, what was that movie with Brad Pitt and they were tracing, it was Seven. That was the name of it, Seven.
Seven, yeah.
Okay, when I think of serial killers, I think of that movie and I think of Silence of the Lambs.
Hmm. Yeah, scary.
I just
Well,
can't. And that's not even real, but ugh.
yeah,
Anyway.
so you just touched on something like the media situation, which is
Yeah.
a component of what the next part I'm going to talk about. I found this really good piece on The Atlantic that delved into the why of the rise in serial killers, particularly in the 80s into the 90s. There's a lot to deconstruct, but they interviewed some criminologists. And there was this guy, James Allen Fox from Northeastern University in Boston. And in this article, he said that the rise in the serial killings in that era had a bunch of roots, right? But first was that rise in violent crime, right? Even if you weren't part of it or you weren't a victim of one, it was becoming a bigger part of American fabric because it was there and you were hearing about it. And whether it was more or not, the feeling that this is just a part of life was kind of happening in everyone's brains. Uh, they were witnessing and hearing more about it. So there's that. people were becoming more mobile. And this happened really 60s, 70s, 80s, but they weren't staying in the city where they were born and raised. More people were moving other places and moving more than once or twice or whatever. You have a military family, so
Yeah.
maybe the military's always been doing that, but citizens were doing this more often. It was easier to
Hmm.
do. There were more established suburbs throughout the country. So a lot of times people just didn't know each other as
Yeah.
well, right? You could have a neighbor who just moved in. You don't know where they came from. And when you couple that with the next thing I'm going to say, horrible, not horrible, it's just the technology didn't exist. There's no databases talking to each other.
For real. Yeah.
So if you move from Utah to Florida, nobody in Florida can like run anything on you to find out what you did in Utah. Could
Hmm.
law enforcement make some phone calls? Of course. But if you don't give any reason for that, like why would they? Why
Hmm.
would they? And so there were a lot of quote unquote bad people that could move around undetected and commit crimes. And people in the new place wouldn't necessarily know. That's a lot harder to do today. Still possible, but a lot harder. And
Hmm.
then on top of it, DNA evidence was in infancy. Like people couldn't figure out based on finger, maybe fingerprints, but any sort of like bodily DNA who had been where. And even if they kept those things, knowing, okay, we might be able to use this at some point, again, there's no database to run that against.
Hmm. Which is
So,
wild because
yeah.
you think about like, I don't know, the 80s was 40 something years ago, right? Like,
Hmm.
but in reality, that's not that long a time ago.
Hmm.
Because, and you think of all the technology, all the things that exist now related to crimes, like you said, DNA testing, the database. I didn't even think about that till you started talking about it. Like not having that electronic database, you had to have paper files that you would fax to another place.
Hmm.
It was, you know what else I thought of too? It was a lot easier to forge things
Oh, yeah.
um, because you didn't have the barcodes and the holograms and the things. Like I was talking to somebody the other day about like when I was in college, I had like 3 fake IDs because it was so easy. Like I never got in
Yeah.
trouble. Like, don't do that, children. That's the dumbest thing in the
No,
world.
no,
Don't
don't
do that.
don't learn from your auntie Danny.
But you
Don't
can't
do
do
what
it
she did.
anymore anyway. You really
Hmm.
can't. There's no way. Um, I mean, there are ways, I'm sure, but it's not, it takes a lot more legwork. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I so
It's very hard nowadays to fly under the radar.
oh yeah, for
Like,
real. Even if you
and
like want to as a normal person. Like
that's what I mean. Like,
yeah.
obviously, like I have no reason to do that, but if you think about it, you're really documented everywhere you go. Then if you have a phone on top of it, then if you're checking in on social media or you have Life 360 or Find My iPhone or anything like that, it is really hard and bank cards and ATM footage. Like if you really wanted to not be able to have anyone find you, it's almost impossible.
Yeah.
Almost impossible. Which was not the case in the 80s. Definitely not in the years before that either. And another reason that these criminologists say there was a rise of serial killers in the 80s, particularly, and I hate to do this, to blame the
Mhm.
media, but there
Oh,
was that, which you've
the
touched on,
sensationalism. Yeah.
this fascination, um, and a snowball effect from that, right? And also, the United States had had an interstate system long before the 80s, but the continued development of that, and again, just this way that people could get around so much easier from place to place. And then when you put in there hitchhiking, which, you know, is not the main source of serial killers, but it's certainly part of a lot of their stories,
Hmm.
right? And people using the interstates to get places. It gave them, these serial killers, more space to roam and kind of be not noticed.
Hmm.
So anyway, there was one interesting theory. I'm interested to see what you think. So there's this other criminologist in that piece. His name's Peter Vronsky, and his hypothesis is this. He thinks that the North American serial killer boom or whatever of the late 20th century, right? So 70s, 80s, 90s, can be traced to World War II. And that has something to do with the children of the men returning from the battlefields of Europe and the Pacific. And he says that this was a quote from him that it was a war that was far more vicious and primitive than we have ever been able to acknowledge. And that these men came back with all this trauma and baggage, and a lot of them were prone to violence
Hmm.
more than was reported. And so it kind of just had this sort of, I guess, snowball effect from there, the way they
Hmm.
interacted with their children. Not even necessarily the soldiers themselves' fault. Maybe some of that is what he's saying, but just the war itself, that it kind of opened up this whole realm of understanding of violence and
Hmm.
warfare that really took hold in that next generation of
Yeah.
people that were born after that. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense to me because wartime is there's no way to not have trauma if you have served in any kind of wartime effort, whether you are on the ground, in the air, on a boat, in a hospital. There's no way. And I will tell you firsthand accounts. I mean, I wasn't in a wartime zone, but my husband was a couple of times. And the military does not tend to your mental health, okay,
Mm-mm.
like effectively. They're getting better, but it's still, especially, you know, the higher up you are in the military, they don't want you to have any red flags. And so a lot of things get overlooked. And we're talking, this is, 2024. So to
Well,
think back to World War II, when we didn't even have words like mental health or trauma, and related to military service members, I can't even imagine because you have these emotional wounds that you're told to just deal with and ignore, and they're if you don't tend to a wound, it's going to keep festering.
hmm
So, on one hand, it's like, well, if you don't have the tools or even the awareness to know what you're going through, you're gonna lash out. You're gonna have things, and then that's
hmm
gonna affect your kids because we do know with research that if you are susceptible to lots of violence and trauma and abuse in your childhood, you are more susceptible to inflicting that on others when you get older. If you have not been, again, treated or addressed or whatever. So I think that he's probably, I mean, I'm no psychologist, I'm no
hmm
psychiatric expert, but I think that makes sense to me. I
hmm
mean, generational trauma is a thing too.
Yeah, I think we tend, even nowadays, to try to blame whatever bad thing is happening to like what's immediately surrounding it,
Yeah.
right? Like even with kids now, it's like, oh, well, parents are just letting them be on their phones or like
Mhm.
whatever, or oh, everyone has depression now because, all these kids have depression because they see it on TikTok or whatever, instead of like taking a step back and going, well, that didn't just happen overnight.
Right.
Like maybe we should look at this, go back a bit. And this guy went way back
Mhm.
to like the
Yeah.
40s, but it makes sense because those kids were born and were in adulthood and committing these crimes right during that time frame.
Well, then that also
Um,
makes me think of like Vietnam and maybe and that
mhm,
war, we
right?
we won't dig into the weeds there, but and the emotional trauma that people had coming back and the things they were doing. And, I think of that too, because yeah, I mean, you don't have language for what you're experiencing. If nobody's giving you the language and the awareness, how can you fix it? How can you,
Exactly. Yeah,
how can
Vietnam's
you,
a good point. I don't want to
yeah.
like speak out of turn because I didn't research that specifically. But I would guess if I looked into the serial killers of this era, there's some
Yeah.
some people who fought in Vietnam included in there. There probably have to be with that age group anyway.
Right. That's what I was thinking in my brain as we
Yeah.
were talking. Like, oh yeah, like World War II. If your parents were in World War II, then you would have
Mhm.
been, because my dad was uh my dad was a conscientious objector during Vietnam, and then
Mhm.
he dated my mom, who her dad was an army officer. So like, he was not thrilled when he found that out. So
Oh, I was
anyway,
gonna say, how did that go?
not well at first, but anyway.
My dad, I remember asking him when I was a kid, it's like, were you in Vietnam? But he is deaf in one ear, so he was disqualified. He said when he was a young man, he was like really bummed about it. But
Yeah.
like as he got older, he was like, okay, that was probably all right. Like,
Yeah.
yeah.
Anyways.
Anyway, okay.
Okay.
So I have brought 5 true crime cases
Oh
from the
God.
80s. Each of these, and I know this because I've listened to podcasts on them, could have a whole hour to 2 on their own. These are ones I'm relatively familiar with, and I did a little, more research for today just to make sure I knew what I was talking about. So you can ask questions. If I know the answer, I'll let you know. I'm also going to
Okay.
link in the show notes the best true crime podcasts for each of these that I've found. If you want to, if we mention one and you're like, oh, I remember that, and you want to hear more of the details, or if you're like, I don't remember that at all, and you want to hear about it, I'm gonna link those in there. So if you want
Okay.
further listening, friends. All right. So the first one, which I'm sure you've heard of, 1983, the kidnapping and murder of Adam Walsh.
Hmm.
Right. So in
Which
19,
founded, is that the one whose dad founded America's Most Wanted?
yes,
Okay.
yes,
Sorry, did I just go
John
forward to?
Walsh. No, that's okay.
Sorry.
Most people are probably thinking that. So that's
Okay.
why
Just wanted to
this
ask.
case is so famous, partially. So in 1979, to go back a few years, there was a disappearance of a 6-year-old named Eton Potts, and that's still unsolved.
Oh my
Nobody knows who took him, why, whatever. I believe in that story, he was walking to the bus stop, and it was the first day he'd done it by himself.
God. Oh
So
no,
can you
stop.
imagine being this
Mm-mm.
boy's mother?
Mm-mm. Mm-mm.
He was like, "Can I please? I'm big enough. I'm old enough." And he never made it to the bus.
Oh,
And of
see,
course,
I can't.
of course, back then, the mom thought he was at school all day.
Oh my God.
So they don't even start looking for him and the school thinks he's sick or whatever. They don't even start looking for him till 5 o'clock at night or something. Yeah.
Oh,
So that was in 79. So then in 83 was a kidnapping, murder, and unfortunate, sorry, Danny, decapitation of Adam Walsh, who was
I didn't
also
know
sick.
this. I did
Yes,
not know this.
yes.
Okay, I'm already like writhing. I can't.
Yeah. So we'll just get through
Okay.
this quickly. We'll just get through this quickly
Okay.
and
All
get to
right.
the not silver lining. I don't want to call it that, but get to like the little bit of good that's maybe come out of this. He was in a department store with his mom.
I do remember this. Yeah.
Yep. So he had, how kids are, was like wandered off for 30 seconds and
Mm.
ended up, they did find and convict someone of this crime, Otis Toole, who had basically coaxed him out of the store with him somehow. And then once they were like out the door, grabbed him, took him, all the things. Um, so anyway, there was all sorts of things. But the first thing it inspired was a TV movie called Adam.
Yep. I remember that.
And this ended with a roll call of photos, descriptions of missing children, right?
Hmm.
Over the course of the 3 broadcasts, Adam ended up, Adam movie, reunited 37 children with family members who were looking for them.
Wow.
Yeah, 37. That's amazing.
Crazy.
And so his father, John Walsh, became a very active, outspoken victims' right advocate in the wake of his son's death. And in 1988, it translated to him hosting and helping launch America's Most Wanted, which was on Fox, dedicated to bringing criminals on the lam to justice. and it ran for 25 seasons
Yeah, that's a long
and
time.
reportedly led to the capture of over 1,200 fugitives.
That's,
Yeah.
ooh, I remember
And
that movie.
okay,
I remember this case. Like, because like I said, I was a scared cat.
scared cat.
I mean, that's true. I was a
Yeah.
scaredy cat. And the thought of disappearing when you think you're in a safe spot terrified me.
Hmm. Yeah.
You know, you're at a department store with your mom, like that, you're not scared, right?
Right.
So,
Yeah.
ugh, mm,
Yeah, that's a
mm,
rough one. And some other things have come out of it too. I know there's like Adam's Law, which it basically improves how we look for missing children, how much
mhm,
information families can have access to, because there was a lot of that in that case too. And I don't think it was negligence on purpose. I just think that the procedures weren't properly in place yet for how these things were handled. And then there's like an Adam alert, which is different than an Amber alert. So an Adam alert happens like at a physical place if a kid's missing.
okay.
So I want to say it's not an actual law. I should have looked this up. Don't worry, listeners, I will follow back. But it's something stores and corporations can adopt. And it's basically like how you would operate a lockdown if
Mm,
that happened, how you would lock down the store until the child is found and reunited with their family, potentially the parking lot, things like that. I know Walt Disney World, for example, has a version of that in place.
mhm,
So just kind of having this way that people can immediately mobilize to find missing children is due in big part to Adam Walsh's family,
mhm,
which good for them. Like,
mhm,
man,
yeah,
I don't know if I could or would. Now, his mom has never been very public,
right.
right? Like she obviously supports all of the things that have come out of it, but she's not been the face of it.
Mhm.
And I don't blame her, you know.
Yeah, that's
That's
what again, as we're talking, my stomach is like turning. I have my like cup of wine
yeah.
here right in front of my face now
Okay.
because I am so stressed out. Like, not, and that's a trauma laugh right there. That's not laughing at this case or
Mm-mm.
that's just how I handle things. But
Yeah. Yeah.
it's
And
just,
you're right about the
yeah,
ones with children are really hard. I
yeah.
often won't listen to one about kids, or if it has to do with children hurting other children, like bullying that led to something like a death or a suicide. I won't listen to those. I just
Yeah.
can't. Even though they're real and they
Hmm.
matter, it's too hard. And
Yeah.
all lives matter, of course. Like I mean that outside the context of
Oh,
bumper sticker
yes.
phrases.
Yes. Yes.
Every single person who has a crime committed against them matters. But of course, it's hard to hear about kids and kids committing crime. I think is a lot
Ah,
more difficult to swallow.
yeah.
But speaking of that, we're going to move on. Here we go.
Okay.
1986. Have you ever heard of the Preppy murder?
No. Is it like
I thought you
Heather's?
might not like this one, but you might be like, because of the title. Okay, so here we go.
Like, wait, you really thought I was gonna like something that was a real life murder story? No, ma'am.
I just thought you would like the title of the
All I thought was
Preppy
Heather's.
murder.
As soon as you said it, I thought Heather's.
Yeah, that's what I think of too. I think of
Yeah.
like the schoolgirl outfit, like the plaid
Uh-huh.
skirt, the little tie, and the blazer.
Croquet.
Seriously, though, that's not far off.
Oh.
So, after a night of underage drinking in August 1986 at a popular Manhattan bar, so
Hmm.
these kids have money, Robert Chambers, 19, fatally strangled Jennifer Levin, 18, during a bout of what he described as rough sex in Central Park.
Ooh.
However, he didn't like go tell anyone or do anything. He just left. So a jogger discovered Levin's semi-nude body, and police quickly apprehended this Chambers guy because he was like the last one seen with her. They were seen walking in the park. People saw them leave the party together, whatever. But here's the thing about this Robert Chambers. He was very good looking.
Ugh. Was he
Oh,
white?
oh yeah, they
Oh, of
both
course.
were. They both were.
Right.
Um, he So like even like I've looked back on some articles from the time, he was described as having movie star looks, like all this crazy stuff. And the fact that he supposedly was very good looking, it's hard to even like care about that, but this is what was referenced. And the crime went down among these young prep school graduates from these very influential families. Newspapers and news outlets dubbed it the preppy killer, and the name stuck around forever. And then, yeah, so it was kind of like him saying it went like this, but then the evidence didn't connect, right? Like without getting into
Mm-hmm.
too many details, there's like a rock involved that she was hit with and all these things that he really couldn't explain away, you know? Like, so another totally 80s thing that has to do with this. Part of the reason this became so sensationalized is because, did you ever watch A Current Affair?
Oh yeah.
It was just starting and they picked up this story.
Oh, stop.
And so this was one of their big, like, debut cases.
So we should tell people what that is.
Yes.
Yeah,
So
yeah, yeah,
it's an Americanized version of this Australian news show that specialized in like lurid and
yeah.
sensational
Uh-huh.
stories. Yeah.
It's like it was almost like what I think of like a video version. Oh, it's kind of like TMZ. Like you know how TMZ is like
Yep.
sensationalized, or like the National Enquirer, even though some of that is like totally made up. But it was very, very sensationalized and very, what's the right word I'm looking for? It was kind of cheesy. It was very glamorized crime, if that makes sense. Yeah, anyways. So they picked up
Yeah.
this case. Okay. They picked up this case. Got it.
Yeah, they picked it up and they covered it for almost a year
Oh,
while it was
wow.
like going on, like in between other things that they covered. So essentially he this Chambers guy, Robert Chambers, ended up being convicted of manslaughter, not murder. Yeah, for like accidentally. So essentially, they like believed his story,
So
even
many
though,
things to say.
yeah. And there's more background on this. I will link to a longer show about it, but he had like a history of violence against women and things like that. So he did
Mm,
serve 15 years, but he was like 20 when he was sentenced. So he's been out of prison since he was like 35.
stop. Okay, so you're saying he was rich, number one. If
Hmm.
y'all don't think that capitalism don't affect our criminal justice system, you are mistaken. Like, so he had money. He also was white, so and he was male. So he had lots of privilege. Plus, you said he was extremely good looking, right?
Yeah,
So people always think that good looking people, like they're always so amazed that good looking people are do evil things. Like, why is that?
it's weird,
It's so
right?
weird.
I think that's weird,
I
but
find
it's
that
true.
very bizarre. I find
Hmm.
that very bizarre because
Yeah.
I can think of plenty extremely attractive people that are the not nicest. I mean, they're not, I don't think that they're out there killing people, but they're not the nicest. Like, you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
of course, I know plenty of extremely attractive people that are the kindest, lovingest people, of course. But, uh-oh, Katie has somebody coming in her
I
bathroom.
thought I had it locked, but it's okay.
Uh-oh,
It's okay, listeners. We're good. It was Tegan, my little one. She's gone.
she wants to go to Walmart.
She actually wanted to pee, and I am in the bathroom, so I just told her to go to a different one.
There you
So we're
go.
okay.
Okay.
Um, so what you're saying about him is so true, like about the capitalism of it all.
Ugh.
So, but this might make you feel a little better. He got arrested again in 2007 for selling drugs out of his apartment. So for nothing violent. But because of that, he was actually sentenced to 19 years in
Oh,
prison,
dang.
which think about this.
I know.
An 18-year-old girl literally died at his hands,
Hmm.
and he served less time for that than finding drugs in his apartment.
I cannot. No.
Like, huh? And he's actually already out on that. He got out early on that charge.
So he's
So
walking around the
he's
earth.
he's walking around the earth somewhere. Hopefully not our neighborhood.
So great
But
to know
yes,
that.
so that was the preppy killer. That was a big one, mostly
Mhm.
because of our our jam, current affair. Okay. Have you heard of this one? Teresa Saldana, 1984. She was an actress attacked by a stalker.
Oh, yeah, there was a Lifetime movie or something about that, I think.
Yes, definitely. Definitely. Okay, so Teresa Saldana, she was in films like I Want to Hold Your Hand, 1978, and Raging Bull, 1980.
Oh, right.
So she was on the rise, Brooklyn born, from New York City. There was this guy, Arthur Richard Jackson, who stalked her and almost fatally attacked her. So she did not die, Danny. They're
Hmm,
not all
hmm.
murders. Don't
I knew
worry.
that. I knew that because I know there's a movie about it. I know it. I'm gonna Google it as we're talking. What
Hmm.
was her name?
Teresa, it's the
Uh-huh.
TH version, Teresa
Okay.
Saldana.
Okay. Keep talking. I'm gonna look it
Yeah,
up real quick.
so here's what happened. On March 15th, 1982, Jackson, Arthur Richard Jackson, was a 46-year-old drifter, their language. 46-year-old
I got you.
about town.
Okay.
And he lunged at her outside her West Hollywood apartment building in broad daylight, stabbed
Oh,
her 10 times with so much force the blade of his knife bent. But delivery man, I don't know how many people were around, but a delivery man intervened and subdued him, and she survived after intensive surgery and a long period of recovery.
my gosh.
Yeah, so that's another one where she took what happened and has turned it into good. She founded the support group Victims for Victims, which is just what it sounds like, right? Like a support group
Yeah.
of victims. And she starred as herself in the TV movie Victims for Victims, the Teresa Saldana story.
Oh, that's what I just looked up. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then she also in 1991 hosted Confessions of a Crime, which was a cable TV series that featured an episode based on the real Fatal Attraction murder, which was a 1987 Kansas incident involving legal secretary Linda Culbertson and her boss, Don Pierce.
Oh my goodness.
So she kind of like talked about some other things on that show as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, okay. I'm
Okay.
glad she was okay.
Me
That's
too.
scary.
Me too.
I
Me too.
I really like, TV movies were a big thing back in the day, kiddos. Like,
Hmm.
and I feel like there were so many true crime ones. Like that
There were.
was like most TV movies I can think of from like, and my mom would watch them because they were dramas.
Mhm.
Um, I remember the Adam Walsh one, and I remember, I guess I didn't know I remembered this one, so we started talking about it. And I wonder if you're
Yeah.
going to talk about the next one, so I won't say anything yet. So
Okay. Maybe. I have two
I'll wait.
more.
Okay.
This next one we won't spend a lot of time on because it's very sad, but it does speak to what you were talking about with the preppy murders,
Uh-huh.
as it relates to race and socioeconomics and capitalism in the criminal justice
Oh,
system.
is this the Central Park Five?
No, but
Oh,
that's a
okay.
good guess.
We'll talk about that in a minute. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, this is called the Atlanta Child Murders. This was
Oh,
1979 to 81. So it's a series of them. Between 79 and 81, at least 28 children, mostly young black boys, were murdered in and around Atlanta. It shook the city to its core, raising fears of a racial motivation behind the killings. I mean, yes, I would think that as well, with that many of them. Eventually, Wayne Williams was arrested and convicted for two of the murders, and the authorities did link him to the other ones, but he was never formally charged because they didn't have enough evidence. And the case has left lingering doubts and debates since then about whether
Mhm.
justice was truly served if they caught the real person.
Oh my
Just
goodness.
kind of a brief one. But yeah, interesting. Like, I hadn't remembered that one. I guess this was before I was even born, but I feel like the preppy murder I kind of knew, Adam Walsh I kind of knew, but here's like 28 children of color, and I'm like, oh, I've never heard of that. You
Mm.
know, it just kind of speaks to the way information is presented. right? And that's
Mhm.
partially why we revisit all these things
Yeah.
because, yeah. And I don't know much else on that one. That was just kind of that. So the last one I have, and then we can talk about the Central Park Five. Um, have you heard of the Night Stalker, Richard
Oh,
Ramirez? You don't know about this
no.
one? Ooh, okay.
Great. It
19,
sounds super great. So let's just do it.
yeah. Okay. 1984 to 1985. So short-lived at least. And we do know who he is, Richard Ramirez. His reign of terror began in 84 when he went on a brutal killing spree in Los Angeles and San Francisco. He broke into homes at night, sexually assaulted, murdered, and often mutilated victims. His crimes seemed random. They couldn't connect like any of them, like age, gender, ethnicity, other than like geographic location, um, which has made him sort of this puzzle of serial killers in modern history. He was captured in 85 after being recognized by residents who beat him down until the police arrived. He was sentenced to death, but he ended up dying of cancer in 2013 while on death row. And they never did really, again, I'll link to like a longer episode on him, like figure out why. This guy was weird too. Like he would like separate, like he would break in where there were couples. So you would think he would just break in where there's like a woman by herself or something, but he would deliberately go where there were couples and like split them up. And like in one case, like put dishes on a guy and was like, if I hear these move at all, she's dead. And like take the woman and do something else. It very weird. They found like sandwiches he had eaten in people's kitchens, like just weird stuff. Very odd. Yeah.
I'm just,
That's my fifth one. Your
oh
face
my God.
is
I'm just sitting here
saying so
like, oh
much.
my God. Well,
Yeah.
this is not our most lighthearted fare, but of
No.
a podcast. While you were talking, I was remembering I actually know someone who is a true crime survivor from the 80s. She was abducted as
Ooh.
a college student. It's actually horrible. She was actually on a TV show called I Survived
Hmm.
on, I think you know what? I don't know what channel that's on.
I've
It's
heard
like
of that
A&E or
before.
something.
Yeah, or Identity TV or ID TV or something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Not like a few years back, and I'm not going to say her name because I'll send it
Hmm.
to you personally, but
Yeah.
I don't, I mean, she's very vocal, obviously, in her story because was on a network show about it. But
Right.
I met her. She actually she works for a lot of victim abuse like rights groups and stuff, and she shares her story a lot. Um, and basically she was coming home from a bar. She was in college to her apartment, and three guys followed her, abducted her in a truck, brought her to an abandoned barn, and abused her, all the things you could think of, left her for dead, and she ended up getting out and surviving. But it
Oh
was
my
just
goodness.
to hear somebody that you know personally that like went through something that you only have read about, seen on TV, man. Yeah,
Hmm.
I hadn't thought about that in a while because she's not a close friend. We're just acquaintances, and I
Hmm.
haven't seen her in a few years. But as you were talking, I was thinking about that, about the guy following it. Like
Hmm.
I don't know. I This is why I can't do true crime because it's real. Like it's all
Yeah,
real. It's
I know.
like, oh,
It is. And I think I tried to grab like a combination of things. Obviously, if you were just to Google like big true crime stories from the 80s, you would get like way more than five, right? But I was trying to sort of touch on, right, like this whole stranger danger, child abduction thing, which I think we can kind of make light of now, especially and be like, oh yeah, like even in the intro, I'm like, are you scared of people in vans and candy?
yes.
But like
I mean, I still
literally
am.
this actually happened,
I know.
and the statistics, show that most people, most children are abducted by people they know. Often it's a family member, often they're not in danger. It's still not right, but there are cases like this. where it's
Mhm.
random. And it does happen. And it doesn't matter if it's one in 100,000 or 200,000 or 300,000, whatever the stat is, which obviously I don't have. I'm just making it up. It doesn't matter because that's one.
Right.
And, who could that be? So I think I was trying to kind of touch on that. And then this preppy murder, like the preppy, good looking person that could commit a crime. I mean,
Right.
taking
Right.
it back to Ted Bundy, people are like, oh, he was kind of good
Ah,
looking and
well, and
normal.
Jeffrey Dahmer
And
too. Yeah.
yeah,
Right.
absolutely. And then, this being attacked by a stalker sort of situation, um, missing children that, somehow this number got to 28 in Atlanta and they still couldn't figure it out. And then these kind of like tertiary wild serial killers, right? Like that also exist, as rare
Well,
as
and
they may be.
to go back to the Atlanta case you were speaking of, can you imagine the frustration of those parents and family members trying to say, this is something's happening to the children in our community and you are not listening
Hmm.
until 28 of them are gone. Like, I cannot, there's no excuse for that. Like, there's just not. Like, ugh, it just makes me sad. And now,
Yep.
now that we're continuing to talk about that, has there been a movie done about that case?
Not that I know of. Not that I know of. Why is it
Because
ringing a bell to you?
it is, and I'm not sure what, I mean, I used to be very heavily involved in like um social justice,
Hmm.
groups. And that sounds like maybe a case that was discussed and about
Probably.
racism in the judicial system. And, I don't know. But anyways,
Yeah. Yeah.
um,
Well, since you mentioned the Central Park Five, I have it pulled up here, but what is your recollection of that?
well, and we don't have to go too far into the weeds with this because it's a
Hmm.
whole very long story. There was a jogger, a lady, a female jogger who was assaulted in Central Park. And they wrongly arrested and convicted five, I think it's five young men,
Hmm.
teenagers. They were teenagers. One was like I think 12 or 13. Like they were so young. And they were in jail for decades before they were exonerated.
Hmm.
Decades. And they have a movie about them. It was like a series, I think it was on Netflix. It is
Hmm.
so hard to watch. It is so hard to watch. Um, but have you seen it? Do you know what I'm
I
talking about?
haven't seen it. I
Okay.
know I know the case. Um, I know it ended up, they put the five away and then later a single guy,
Mhm.
a serial rapist
Mhm.
confessed and they were able to use
Mhm.
evidence, DNA, whatever, because so much time had passed
Yeah.
to prove that, oh wait, it was just this one guy. Yeah.
It was what they did to those kids because they did not know who did this to this woman.
Hmm.
Um, they tricked them into signing confessions. I mean, they're young kids, they're terrified. They were in the wrong place at the wrong time. They were at the park hanging out. I mean, they're kids in a city.
Hmm.
Where are you gonna, you know what I'm saying?
Where are you gonna go? Yeah.
Um, and they were five black teenage boys. And when I tell you that racism played a huge part, obviously, in why they were wrongly convicted, it was so sad. And
Yep.
they were, I mean, anyway, we don't have to go into that whole story, but
Yeah,
when you were talking about that, I thought of that case. I mean, the lady did survive.
she
She did
did.
survive. Yeah.
And she
But
didn't have any memory of
right.
the
That,
attack, so that was part of the problem.
yeah,
Yeah.
she did not have any memory. And again, I don't remember if it was the late 80s or early 90s when this happened, but they didn't have the testing and all the things. And the cops just wanted to put a name on it. They wanted
Yeah. Right.
somebody to name.
Well, and you
And
figure Central Park, like you think of tourism and the capitalism there
mhm,
and all the heat. This happened in 89. And so
yeah.
New York City, particularly those touristy parts, Times Square,
Mhm,
Central Park, all of that Broadway area were really under fire for not being safe places to travel. And
mhm.
so the police, you know, again, I'm simplifying this, but they just wanted to close the case. And if you could blame this group that, like you said, wrong place, wrong time, there were also dozens of other people in the park at that time, you know,
Exactly. Exactly.
but they could just sort of do that. And like you said, I think even back then, and we know a lot more now about false confessions than we did back then. We
Mhm.
think like if someone says, "Oh, I did this thing," well, why in the world would they say something like that if they hadn't done it? Well,
Right.
there's a lot of reasons that they
Oh
would,
my gosh.
right?
These kids were they were tricked into saying it because they wanted to go home, especially the young one. And the horrible things they went through in jail. I mean, is one I think died in jail.
Hmm.
Um, anyway, if you want a flashlight spotlight shone on not just our justice system, but also our uh, prison system, you should watch that show. And
Yeah.
they actually the surviving members were they had a interview with Oprah after the movie came out or the series came out, where she talked to them, and it was heartbreaking because could tell some of them were just damaged
Hmm.
beyond,
Beyond help.
yeah. And it
Yeah, I
was
I had just pulled this up. The one of their last names is Salam. He
mhm,
became a board member of the Innocence Project,
mhm, mhm,
which is a huge criminal justice reform group, especially for juveniles. And he
mhm,
actually received the Lifetime Achievement Award in 2016
mhm.
from Barack Obama. I
Yeah,
mean, like at what cost, right?
right.
But
Exactly.
he actually won a seat on New York City's city council too
Yeah.
in
So
2023.
just so just to swirl it back around to what we were talking about
Hmm.
today, true crime is hard for me because these are real people. Like this is
Hmm.
real life. So I can watch some cats being buried in a cemetery and then coming back because I know it's
Well, they
not
come
real.
back anyway, so it's fine. Like whatever.
Like that is
Yeah.
okay for me. And I can watch the Crypt Keeper and his silly tales of horror because it's not real.
Hmm.
But when you give me that real stuff, I just have a hard time. Like, I don't know. I'm gonna get off this Zoom and I'm gonna be like, what was that?
Why did Katie make me do this?
And I'm like, I just make her talk about snorks.
That's why I made you do this. I'm getting
No,
back at you. No, I
like
I
I,
mean, I think it's important. I will say like I so we didn't talk about crimes in my house growing up. I have a story in the 90s a personal story, nothing that happened
oh,
to me, but something that was in my purview growing up that was a true crime story that we'll talk about in the 90s episode. But I, my family was very like, didn't watch the news. I know my parents read the newspaper. They weren't like closed off, but they just didn't think that we should have that sort of negativity in the house. And they didn't like to talk about stuff like that. So as a result, like my whole worldview on like what crimes really happen, how to protect myself as a woman living in America, especially as a young
mhm,
woman when I was at college and then I lived by myself out of college, I've sort of had to build on my own.
uh-huh.
And I think listening to true crime stories, particularly the places that do it really well, has helped me with my worldview, certainly like my humanity, kind of understanding that while nothing, no trauma that happens to you is an excuse to
Hmm.
harm others, it's sometimes a reason, right? And
Yeah.
so I think understanding that it's not just like good versus evil, that there's all these like very layered
Oh, yeah.
traumas and generational traumas and mental health issues and war stuff and like abuse as a child and religion in some cases, right? Like that it's really made me understand the world better. Um, you know, again, at what cost, right? Are we having nightmares? Are we sad? I have trouble with the wrongful conviction things too, because
Mm.
especially growing up in the 80s and 90s, you just think, no, bad people go to jail. And if you're in jail, you're bad.
Mhm. Mhm.
And then when you start to kind of go, no, that's not really how it works.
No,
Not all the
no.
time.
Yeah.
Um, I mean, this is a very small example, but I have a family member incarcerated right now. And just to talk with this family member on the phone costs so much money.
Yeah.
And it's through a private company,
Yeah.
right? So you put money on the card, but then there's like a 20% fee on top of that. And then when they call you, they take X amount plus this. And there's nothing you can do about it because that's the contractor that got that
Mhm.
bid. And I think like I can call this family member because even though I don't want to spend all this extra money on fees and things like that, I will. And I'll put enough on there for them to call me or call others. Like think of all the people that can't.
Oh, yeah.
Like
Yeah.
even incarceration, there's no equality,
Mhm. Mhm.
right? So
Yeah.
and it's just really I'm just always like, what a racket. But there's no
Oh, it is.
recourse,
No. I
you
mean,
know? So,
we could talk for hours on how our prison system in this country was even started and how compared to other countries, we are so backwards in what we do. I mean, prison is supposed to be a rehabilitation, and so you can be reintroduced to society. Yes, you're serving time, but also like it's not just supposed to be go sit in this cell, we're going to punish you, we're going to torture you, and
mhm,
then we're going to release you. Like that's not humane, and that's not what is supposed to happen. And other countries
mhm.
do a much better job. And guess what? Their crime rates are lower.
Yeah.
Just saying.
Yeah, no, it's
Anyway,
true. It's so true. But
anyway,
yes,
that,
like you said, another topic. So
another
listen,
topic.
if you listen today, hopefully, I don't know if liked is the right word, but you had some thoughts when we were having
Sure.
these conversations around these things, or maybe you remembered some your view of crime growing up, or some of these true crime stories or others. We'd love to hear about it. Reach out to us either on our socials or Generation In Between Podcast at Gmail. That's on there too. Uh,
Longest email ever, ever,
yes.
ever.
Um, and if you're feeling heavy after this, look, we have got 50 plus episodes
Yes.
that you can go listen to. If you haven't listened to our candy taste testing, go hit up that one. If you like
We should do
cartoons,
we should do a bonus episode after this one that's just funny.
okay,
Instead, we can do our after show that we do for our patrons, but I think everybody might need something a little lighter after this
agree.
one. Yeah. So
All
we'll
right.
think of something. So something will be in our feed that's short and you can just a palate cleanser if you may.
I love
So
it.
yeah,
I love it. Let's do it.
we'll do that for you.
So on that note, we will have a part two, but don't worry, we'll have a palate cleanser for that too. Coming soon, and spooky season will continue. We have some more special guests
Yay.
coming up, so those will be a
Yay.
lot of fun. And make sure you review us wherever you listen, share us with your friends, join Patreon if you want. It's $8 a month. That's where you can get a lot of bonus content, all of our after
Yeah.
show, including our guests who stick around and join our after shows with us. And I think that's it, guys.
Yeah.
So until next time, don't take candy from strangers,
Oh,
not even on
don't worry.
Halloween.
Oh,
Bye,
wait.
guys.
Okay, bye.